A submarine vanishes beneath the Arctic ice. No distress signal, no wreckage, just silence where there should be a nuclear-powered vessel with 140 souls aboard. And in the chess game of global military power, that kind of silence screams louder than any explosion ever could. Welcome to the razor's edge, where one wrong move triggers World War III. Hunter Killer doesn't ease you into its world. It drags you down to crushing depths where every decision carries the weight of nations. Released in October 2018, this action thriller directed by Donovan Marsh adapts Don Keith and George Wallace's 2012 novel Firing Point into a high-stakes submarine warfare spectacle that operates on two terrifying principles: trust no one, and every second counts. Gerard Butler commands the USS Arkansas as newly promoted Captain Joe Glass, an unconventional officer who earned his rank through merit rather than pedigree. He's not your typical military movie hero. No chiseled jawline speeches about honor and glory. Glass is a tactician who understands that beneath the ocean's surface, arrogance kills faster than torpedoes. When he's ordered to investigate the disappearance of the USS Tampa Bay in Russian territorial waters, he's walking into a geopolitical minefield where the wrong call doesn't just end careers, it ends civilization. But this isn't just a submarine movie. Marsh orchestrates a dual-front operation that splits the tension between underwater cat-and-mouse warfare and a Navy SEAL team infiltrating a Russian naval base on the Kola Peninsula. While Glass navigates the Arctic depths, Lieutenant Bill Beeman's Special Operations Unit discovers something that changes everything. Russian Defense Minister Dmitry Durov has staged a coup, holding President Nikolai Zakharin hostage at a Murmansk military installation. It's not a rogue submarine captain gone mad or a terrorist cell with stolen codes. It's an inside job orchestrated by someone with access to Russia's entire nuclear arsenal. The math is simple and horrifying. One captured president, one robed defense minister itching for war, and two nations whose submarine fleets are now playing lethal hide-and-seek under the polar ice cap. What elevates Hunter Killer beyond standard military thriller territory is its refusal to paint in broad strokes of good guys versus bad guys. When Glass discovers survivors in the wreckage of a Russian Akula-class submarine, including legendary Admiral Sergei Andropov, played by the late Michael Nyqvist in one of his final roles, he makes a choice that defies orders and conventional warfare doctrine. He rescues them, not as prisoners of war, but as potential allies in preventing a conflict neither side actually wants. That decision transforms the film's DNA. Suddenly, the enemy isn't wearing a different uniform. It's wearing ambition and nationalism like armor. Durov doesn't want peace or negotiation. He wants Russia to reclaim superpower status through force, and he's willing to manufacture a war to get it. Meanwhile, back at the Pentagon, Rear Admiral John Fisk and NSA senior analyst Jane Norquist, portrayed by Gary Oldman and Linda Cardellini, face their own impossible calculus: authorize a rescue mission that could be interpreted as an act of war, or abandon the Russian president and watch the world burn. The clock is ticking in multiple time zones. The SEALs are compromised on hostile ground. Glass is navigating a gauntlet of Russian destroyers and attack submarines, any one of which could send Arkansas to the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. And Durov is activating communication jammers to ensure President Zakharin can't call off his military before the point of no return. This is where Hunter Killer plants its flag in the crowded landscape of military action cinema. It's not the hunt for Red October's Cold War cat-and-mouse, though the submarine warfare carries that film's DNA. It's not Crimson Tide's internal power struggle aboard a single vessel. Instead, Marsh weaves together Tom Clancy-style geopolitical intrigue with Michael Bay, adjacent action set pieces, grounding the spectacle in a premise that feels uncomfortably plausible. What happens when the people meant to prevent war are the ones trying to start it? The production committed to authenticity in ways that reshaped the viewing experience. The entire submarine interior was constructed on a massive hydraulic gimbal, a platform that tilts and rotates to simulate realistic movement. When Arkansas dives hard or takes evasive maneuvers, the actors aren't pretending to stumble. They're genuinely fighting for balance as the set pitches at 50-degree angles. Cinematographer Tom Murray shot on ARRI Alexa cameras, capturing the claustrophobic interiors with kinetic energy that makes you feel the steel walls closing in. Every creak of the hull, every barked order, every bead of sweat on Butler's face registers as viscerally real. Above the waterline, the SEAL mission operates on a different frequency. Where the submarine sequences are contained and tense, the land-based infiltration opens up the visual palette. Snowy tundra, Soviet-era concrete architecture, close-quarters combat in tight corridors. The contrast isn't just aesthetic, it's strategic storytelling. Glass fights with silence and stealth, making his submarine invisible. Beeman and his team fight with precision violence, knowing that one gunshot could alert an entire base. And threading through both operations is the human element that genre films often sacrifice for spectacle. Andropov isn't a cardboard villain who suddenly grows a conscience. He's a career naval officer who recognizes that Durov's coup perverts everything he served. The chemistry between Butler and Nyquist's taciturn American pragmatist and weathered Russian patriot carries the film's moral weight. They don't become friends, they become reluctant partners bound by the understanding that some things transcend nationality: the desire to go home, the responsibility to your crew, and the knowledge that nuclear war has no winners. Gary Oldman's Admiral Fisk operates in the realm of impossible decisions, a Pentagon war room where every option on the table courts disaster. Commons Lieutenant Beeman leads his SEALs with quiet competence, the kind of operator who doesn't deliver inspiring speeches because the mission itself is the only motivation required. And Linda Cardellini's NSA analyst Norquist serves as the civilian voice of reason in a room full of military brass eager to show strength. The film unfolds across 121 minutes that refuse to let audiences catch their breath. Marsh orchestrates sequences that layer multiple crisis points simultaneously, Glass evading torpedoes while Beeman fights through the naval base, while Washington debates whether to launch a preemptive strike. The editing rhythm matches the submarine's sonar pings, short, sharp, relentless. But beneath the action thriller surface, Hunter Killer asks a question that resonates beyond its 2018 release. In an era of hair-trigger geopolitics and nationalist fervor, how close are we to stumbling into a war nobody wants but everyone's too proud to prevent? The film doesn't offer easy answers. Instead, it puts flawed, exhausted professionals in impossible situations and watches them choose between bad options and catastrophic ones. This is a film about the wars we don't fight, the catastrophes averted by people whose names never make headlines, whose decisions save millions of lives precisely because those lives never needed saving. Glass doesn't get a medal ceremony. Beeman doesn't get a parade. They get to sail home, knowing that the world almost ended and no one outside a handful of classified briefings will ever know how close it came. Hunter Killer positions itself as throwback entertainment for an audience craving competence. Porn-watching professionals execute complex operations with skill and discipline. Yet it arrives in a cinematic landscape increasingly dominated by superheroes and fantasy epic, offering instead the grounded if heightened tension of military procedural married to blockbuster action spectacle. The Arctic Ocean becomes more than a setting, it's a character that shapes every choice, the crushing pressure, the absolute darkness, the knowledge that one hull breach means death for everyone aboard. Above the surface, the Kola Peninsula's naval base represents a different kind of pressure. The weight of history, of Cold War posturing that never quite ended, of nationalism wielded as a weapon by those who've never had to fight. As we dive deeper into this film's construction, its narrative machinery, character dynamics, technical craft, and thematic undercurrents, we'll explore how Hunter Killer navigates the treacherous waters between popcorn entertainment and legitimate geopolitical thriller, how it balances Gerard Butler's star power against ensemble credibility, how it shoots submarine warfare to feel both authentic and cinematic, and why, in a genre cluttered with jingoistic flag waving, this film finds its tension not in us versus them tribalism, but in the shared recognition that some enemies aren't nations. They're the men who would burn the world to prove their strength. The mission is simple: rescue the Russian president, prevent World War III, and survive long enough to tell no one about it. The execution? That's where things get complicated. The world of Hunter Killer runs on escalation. We begin not with speeches in war rooms, but with steel hulls cutting through freezing water, as American and Russian submarines quietly track each other beneath the Arctic ice. Within minutes, that uneasy balance shatters when an attack from an unknown source destroys both vessels, erasing the usual chain of blame and leaving only questions and debris. Back in the United States, satellite intelligence confirms that the American sub is gone, and its last known position places it dangerously close to Russian territorial waters. The disappearance isn't just a military tragedy. It's a political problem waiting to explode, because no one can prove whether this was an accident, an act of aggression, or the opening move in something far worse. Introducing Joe Glass and the Arkansas. To deal with this crisis, the U.S. Navy reaches for a captain who isn't part of the traditional elite. Joe Glass is pulled from a deployment hunting poachers in the North Atlantic, a detail that quietly tells you everything about him. He spent his career doing the jobs nobody else wanted, succeeding without the usual academy pedigree. When he's given command of the USS Arkansas and ordered to investigate what happened under the ice, It's a test not just of his seamanship, but of whether unconventional thinking can prevent a disaster born from old habits. Glass immediately defines himself by how he listens. He studies sonar traces, questions odd patterns, and trusts the instincts of his crew instead of issuing orders from a position of ego. The culture aboard Arkansas reflects that leadership style: tight, professional, but less rigid than you'd expect from a nuclear submarine where one mistake means instant death. Parallel operation, the SEAL infiltration. While the submarine heads north, a separate thread starts on land, a covert special operations mission tasked with eyes-on confirmation of what's happening inside Russia. Lieutenant Bill Beeman's team is dropped near a strategic naval installation on the Kola Peninsula, forced to move through snow, rock, and industrial infrastructure while staying invisible to patrols and surveillance. Their job isn't to engage, it's to observe and report, which becomes impossible the moment they witness a political nightmare unfolding in real time. From their vantage point, the SEALs watch as the Russian defense minister orchestrates an attack against his own president, using loyalist forces to seize control of the base. The images they transmit back to the United States confirm that what's happening is not a misunderstanding or a misfire, but a deliberate attempt to hijack an entire country's military apparatus from the inside. Stakes at the highest level. Those live feeds land in a secure command center where senior American officials scramble to interpret what they're seeing. Rear Admiral John Fisk must weigh the risk of authorizing deeper involvement against the certainty that inaction will leave a fanatical power broker in charge of Russia's nuclear arsenal. Jane Norquist, the civilian intelligence figure at the table, pushes for decisive but controlled action, arguing that this coup could trigger global destabilization long before any missile actually launches. The problem is that every option they consider looks like an escalation. Send in more forces, and they risk turning a Russian internal crisis into a U.S.-Russia confrontation. Do nothing, and they allow a power-hungry minister to weaponize an entire state without resistance. The film locks these leaders into a scenario where morality and strategy collide. Interfering could be illegal under international law, but standing aside could lead to millions of deaths. First contact. Under the ice out on patrol, Arkansas starts encountering anomalies that don't line up with the official briefing. Wreckage patterns suggest more than a simple collision or equipment failure. There are signs of deliberate attack, carefully executed and concealed. The crew's tension spikes when they detect another sub lurking in the area, one whose behavior doesn't match standard patrol patterns, hinting at a hidden agenda beneath the surface. In this environment, every ping, every course change, every whispered report from sonar carries the potential to tip the balance toward panic or restraint. Glass has to navigate not just enemy waters, but the fear that their own side may be operating with incomplete or outdated information, leaving his crew exposed to dangers nobody in Washington fully understands yet. If you'd like, next we can continue into the mid-story escalation, the rescue of the Russian survivors, the growing alliance, and how the coup tightens its grip. As Arkansas pushes further beneath the ice, the crew finally locates the remains of the missing American submarine and, nearby, the twisted hull of a Russian boat that's been torn open by a precise external blast. The scene feels less like the aftermath of a clash between rivals and more like the cleanup after a carefully staged ambush. Among the scattered debris and tumbling metal, sensors pick up something unexpected, faint signals indicating life inside a damaged Russian vessel trapped on the seabed. At this point, Glass faces a decision no manual covers. He can treat the wreck as hostile territory and move on, or he can risk his own boat to attempt a rescue of foreign sailors whose government might already be preparing to blame his country for the disaster. He chooses the harder path, overriding the instinct to prioritize only his crew's safety and ordering a dangerous maneuver that brings Arkansas close enough to mount a salvage operation in waters where any miscalculation could crush both subs. The risky rescue operation. The effort to reach the survivors plays out like a surgical procedure under extreme pressure. Divers and rescue systems are deployed with tight timing, all while the hull groans and the ice above threatens to trap them in place at current shift. Inside the wreck, the remaining Russian crew members are battered, low on air, and ready to die, believing they've been attacked by the Americans. When the hatch is finally open and the Russian sailors realize they're being saved rather than captured at gunpoint, the tone changes from suspicion to stunned disbelief. The extraction requires trust on both sides. The wounded have to step into the unknown environment of a foreign submarine, and the Americans must welcome aboard men who, hours earlier, were part of an opposing fleet whose movements they tracked as potential threats. Meeting Admiral Andropov. Among the rescued is Admiral Sergei Andropov, a seasoned commander whose reputation carries weight far beyond his damaged uniform. He's not introduced as a caricatured adversary, but as a professional who instantly reads the situation and understands that something deeper is wrong. His own ship was destroyed in a way that defies the official narrative, and he recognizes that blaming an American sub for a meticulously orchestrated strike doesn't add up. The early conversations between Glass and Andropov are guarded, filled with clipped sentences and long silences. The Russian officer tests the Arkansas captain with pointed questions about what he's doing this far into contested waters, while Glass probes for clues about who actually ordered the moves that led both vessels into this deadly trap. Neither man fully opens up, but each senses that the other is more interested in preventing a catastrophe than scoring a tactical win. Building a fragile cooperation trust doesn't arrive in a single moment. It develops through shared recognition of the same danger. When Andropov realizes that the pattern of attacks and the timing of lost communications lines align with an internal power grab back home, he begins to provide tactical insight that no American briefing could offer. He explains the likely disposition of Russian forces, the protocols his navy would follow if they believed foreign enemies were responsible, and how quickly local commanders might be pushed into launching preemptive strikes. Glass, in turn, allows Andropov limited access to Arkansas's operations, enough to show that he isn't merely extracting information for leverage, but genuinely trying to steer both crews away from a collision course with the larger fleet. The alliance remains uneasy, marked by cultural differences and lingering doubt, yet it quietly transforms the submarine into a shared lifeboat for sailors who were supposed to be on opposite sides of the war plan. The coup tightens its grip. Meanwhile, in Russia, the defense minister pushing the coup consolidates power at the naval base. Loyalists take over communications hubs, secure missile facilities, and isolate any officers who might still feel bound to the elected president rather than to the new strongman. The removal of dissent is swift and brutal, sending a clear message to anyone tempted to resist that hesitation will be punished. From this stronghold, the conspirators begin shaping the narrative that will justify a broader conflict. They prepare to present the submarine losses as evidence of American aggression, counting on anger and fear to override careful analysis. By controlling the flow of information to the Russian chain of command, they can trigger mobilization orders that appear legitimate on paper but, in reality, advance their plan to drag the nation into a war launched under false pretenses. SEAL Team, under increasing pressure. On the ground, Beeman's Special Operations Unit shifts from pure reconnaissance to a desperate balancing act. Stay hidden long enough to gather intelligence that proves the coup's existence, while also positioning themselves to act if a narrow chance to extract the president appears. Their safe routes through the base are disappearing. As patrols multiply and security becomes more aggressive, the team navigates rooftops, drainage tunnels, and industrial back corridors, relying on precise timing to slip past cameras and guard rotations. They're close enough at times to hear shouted orders and see prisoners being moved, yet they can't simply start a firefight without turning the entire facility into a kill zone. Every choice they make is calibrated against the understanding that being captured would not only cost their lives but also hand the conspirators proof of foreign interference they could exploit. Rising tension. In Washington, back in the American Command Center, the new flow of information from both Arkansas and the SEAL Team creates a clearer picture but not an easier path forward. Military planners see troop movements, intercepted communications patterns, and on-the-ground footage that all point toward an engineered crisis rather than a spontaneous breakdown. The realization that a faction inside Russia is creating conditions for war forces them to rethink standard deterrence strategy. Decision-makers now debate whether to authorize an unprecedented move, coordinating covertly with loyal Russian elements to rescue their own head of state. This would mean trusting intelligence from officers like Andropov, men who were, until days ago, designated as primary adversaries. It's a strategy built on the hope that shared self-preservation can matter more than decades of rivalry, and the margin for error is razor-thin. Arkansas versus the defensive net. As the coup leaders tighten their control, Russian surface ships and submarines begin establishing a defensive perimeter in the Arctic waters leading back to friendly ports. Any unidentified contact risks being classified as hostile, which effectively turns the ocean around Arkansas into an obstacle course of sonar sweeps, minefields, and patrolling hunters. Guided by Andropov's knowledge of local patterns and hidden approaches, Glass attempts to thread his boat through this growing net without triggering an engagement. The maneuvers demand nerve and precision, silent running at critical moments, dangerous proximity to the seafloor, and calculated gambles on when to hide and when to push forward. Every successful evasion buys them time, but also increases the stakes if they're eventually detected, because by then they'll be deep inside waters where no American vessel is supposed to be. If you'd like to keep going, next we can cover the story's tipping point, the coordinated rescue mission, the direct confrontations at sea and on land, and how all these threads converge toward the climax, again keeping everything fresh with no reused lines. At a certain point, the situation stops fitting inside any existing protocol. American leadership realizes that simply watching events unfold will only guarantee that the coup succeeds and that the world wakes up to a nuclear-armed regime fueled by manufactured outrage. The only viable response is one nobody wants to put in writing: quietly collaborate with loyal Russian elements to pull their president out from under his own rebellious military. This means using Arkansas not only as an observer, but as an active participant in a rescue that crosses political, legal, and ethical lines. The submarine will have to move deeper into contested waters, timing its approach so that it can support an exfiltration operation that never officially happened. It's a move that, if exposed, would look indistinguishable from a hostile incursion. Converting intel into a rescue mission. On the ground, Beeman's team transitions from watching to planning. They study guard rotations, vehicle routes, and building layouts, converting scraps of observation into a workable blueprint. Their objective is clear: reach the building where the Russian president is being held, extract him alive, and then navigate through an armed base to a point where they can link up with outside help. The challenge is that their outside help is a submarine that can't simply surface in a harbor and wait. Every step of the mission has to be synchronized with Arkansas's movements, using windows of distraction and blind spots in the base's coastal defenses. The margin for delay disappears. If they're late by minutes, the sub might be forced to leave, trapped by closing Russian patrol patterns. Andropov's knowledge as a weapon for peace. Inside Arkansas, Andropov becomes something more than a rescued officer. His familiarity with Russian procedures, emergency responses, and ship behaviors turns into an invaluable tool. He can anticipate how his former colleagues will react to unusual sonar contacts or missing patrol reports, and his counsel helps Glass avoid routes that would almost certainly trigger direct confrontation. What makes this alliance compelling is that Andropov isn't blindly siding with the Americans. He's acting out of loyalty to his own country's legitimate leadership, using his expertise to undermine a mutiny that threatens to plunge his homeland and the world into chaos. His guidance refines Arkansas's strategy from simple evasion to something closer to a surgical navigation of enemy defenses. First major clash. At sea, even with meticulous planning, conflict can't be avoided forever. Eventually, Arkansas's presence is detected by a Russian vessel operating under orders from the coup-controlled command structure. The encounter escalates from cautious tracking to a deadly exchange of torpedoes in a matter of moments, forcing Glass to balance aggression and restraint. The resulting engagement highlights the difference between survival and escalation. Glass uses creative maneuvers and environmental advantages, depth changes, temperature layers, and careful timing to neutralize the threat without turning the ocean into a graveyard filled with unnecessary casualties. It's a demonstration of tactical skill, but also of restraint. Winning the skirmish isn't the goal, keeping the broader situation from spiraling is. SEAL Team breaches the inner ring. At the naval base, the rescue phase begins in earnest. Beeman's unit infiltrates closer to the central facility where the president is being held, slipping through choke points that have grown far more dangerous since the coup's forces tightened security. Their path involves moving through maintenance areas, service stairwells, and overlooked side entrances rather than storming main doors. The actual breach is rapid and loud. Once they commit, stealth gives way to speed and controlled violence. They engage guards with carefully targeted bursts, using their knowledge of the building's layout to move toward the holding area before reinforcements can fully mobilize. The team's discipline and communication keep the operation from devolving into chaos even as alarms start to blare. Contact with the Russian president. When the SEALs finally reach the captive head of state, they're confronted with a man who has been isolated but not broken. He understands that whoever rescues him may come from outside his own chain of command, and he has to choose whether to trust heavily armed foreigners appearing at his cell door in the middle of a coup. Beeman's approach is direct and efficient. There's no time for elaborate persuasion. He offers a clear path out and evidence that the situation outside is collapsing into something irreversible. The president recognizes that staying means becoming a puppet or a martyr for the conspirators, while leaving offers at least a chance to reclaim control of his country's military. Fighting through a hostile base extraction proves even more hazardous than the initial breach. Now that the alarm has spread, the base swarms with soldiers moving to lock down gates, secure docks, and block escape routes. The SEALs must shepherd the president through overlapping fields of fire, using smoke, diversions, and aggressive short engagements to keep enemy forces off balance. This sequence showcases the difference between well-trained special operators and a larger but less coordinated force. The team doesn't try to win a prolonged battle. Instead, they create brief, controlled windows to sprint from cover to cover, constantly adjusting their route as new threats appear. Every hallway and courtyard becomes a temporary battlefield that has to be cleared just long enough for the group to pass. Synchronizing with Arkansas. All of this has to align with Arkansas's approach toward a rendezvous point where a small craft can make the final connection between land and sea. Glass times his movements to coincide with gaps in coastal surveillance, using Andropov's insight into how the base's defenses were designed to leave certain narrow corridors less watched. Communication between the sub and the SEALs stays minimal and coded, both to avoid interception and because too much chatter would slow down decisions on the ground. Each side has to trust that the other will hit their marks. If Arkansas arrives too early, it risks being detected as it waits. If it comes too late, the team on land will be overwhelmed before they can reach extraction. Internal Russian resistance awakens. As gunfire echoes through the base and unauthorized orders conflict with what some officers know of the chain of command, cracks start to appear in the coup's facade. Loyal personnel who suspect something is wrong begin quietly dragging their feet, misrouting commands, or offering just enough delay to keep certain units from fully committing to the rebels' plans. This emerging resistance doesn't immediately topple the conspirators, but it complicates their control. Confused reports about the president's status, conflicting accounts of foreign involvement, and unexplained lapses in response time start to erode the illusion of an airtight operation. The coup leaders realize they have less time than they imagined before their narrative unravels. If you want to keep building the essay, next we can move into the climax and resolution, the desperate escape, final confrontations at sea and on land, and how the crisis is ultimately diffused, all while maintaining fresh wording and no recycled lines. With the Russian president in tow, Beeman's team fights toward the water's edge through a base that's now fully mobilized. Every delay increases the risk that Arkansas will be forced to abort and leave them stranded, so the SEALs push forward with a pace that borders on reckless. They use pre-positioned diversions, explosives rigged earlier in their infiltration, to create confusion and draw defenders away from the exit route. The journey becomes a running firefight across open ground, through vehicle depots, and past storage facilities that offer little cover. Soldiers loyal to the coup lay down suppressing fire from elevated positions, forcing the Americans to advance in short sprints while returning fire to keep heads down. The president, not trained for this kind of movement, has to be half-dragged through sections where speed matters more than stealth. Arkansas surfaces in hostile waters. At the designated coordinates, Glass makes the call to bring his submarine dangerously close to the surface in waters patrolled by ships that have explicit orders to destroy unidentified contacts. The risk is catastrophic. If detected, Arkansas becomes a stationary target with limited maneuverability, caught between shallow water and a naval base whose guns can pivot toward any threat. The crew executes the maneuver with tense precision, holding the boat just beneath the surface while preparing to deploy a small inflatable craft that can reach the shore. Every second spent exposed is a gamble, and sonar operators strain to detect any sign that Russian destroyers or aircraft have spotted them. The tension inside the submarine's control room reaches a breaking point as they wait for confirmation that the SEALs are incoming. The extraction under fire. When the team finally reaches the rendezvous point, they're under direct pursuit. Coup forces have identified their direction and are closing fast, using armored vehicles and coordinated squads to seal off the coastline. Beeman's operators lay down defensive fire while pushing the president into the inflatable, which immediately starts racing toward the submerged submarine. The final moments on land are brutal and desperate. The SEALs hold their position just long enough to ensure the boat carrying the president clears the immediate threat zone. Then they collapse their perimeter and pile into their own craft under withering fire. Rounds tear through the water around them as they speed away from shore, knowing that if Arkansas is forced to dive before they reach it, they'll be left floating in the open with nowhere to go. Boarding. The submarine mid-crisis. The transfer from inflatables to submarine hatches happens at breakneck speed, with crew members hauling wet, exhausted SEALs and one soaked Russian president into the hull while incoming fire from the shoreline impacts the water nearby. Glass orders the dive the instant the last man clears the hatch, sending Arkansas plunging downward just as coastal defense systems begin locking onto their position. Inside, the atmosphere shifts from operational focus to controlled chaos. As medics attend to wounded operators, sonar tracks multiple Russian vessels converging on their last known location, and Andropov stands face to face with his own nation's leader, a reunion neither man expected to have aboard an American warship under combat conditions. The president's authority reasserted. Once secured below, the Russian president immediately demands access to secure communications, refusing to wait while his military remains under the control of conspirators. His presence aboard Arkansas creates a diplomatic paradox. Technically, he's on foreign soil in the form of a U.S. submarine, yet he's still the legitimate head of a nuclear power whose forces are hunting that very vessel. Glass and his command make the decision to facilitate contact with loyalist elements in the Russian chain of command, using encrypted channels that Andropov helps establish. The president's voice, confirming he's alive and issuing direct orders to stand down aggressive postures toward American assets, begins to fracture the coup's narrative. Officers who were uncertain about the legitimacy of recent commands now have confirmation that something is deeply wrong. The coup's last desperate move. Realizing that their plan is unraveling, the defense minister and his inner circle make a final attempt to force the conflict they wanted. They order an attack on Arkansas regardless of evolving intelligence, framing it as a necessary response to a foreign incursion, and hoping that once shots are fired, momentum will carry the situation into full-scale war. A Russian attack submarine under direct control of the conspirators moves to intercept and destroy the American boat, operating under sealed orders that bypass the usual verification protocols. The commander of that vessel believes he's following legitimate instructions to eliminate a hostile threat, unaware that he's being used as a pawn in a mutiny that's already collapsing. Final underwater duel. The confrontation between Arkansas and the coup-controlled submarine unfolds in the deep Arctic waters, a high-stakes game of sonar hide-and-seek where both sides maneuver for firing solutions. Glass, still reluctant to kill sailors who may not fully understand what they're part of, tries evasive tactics first, using terrain, decoys, and jamming to avoid a direct engagement. But when the Russian boat commits to an attack run and launches torpedoes, Arkansas has no choice but to respond. The exchange is brief and brutal. Glass's crew fires with precision, targeting the enemy's propulsion rather than going for a kill shot, disabling the attacking sub and leaving it crippled but survivable. It's a tactical victory that prioritizes restraint even in the final moments of combat. The coup collapses from within. As word spreads through Russian military channels that the president is safe and issuing orders, the defense minister's support evaporates. Officers who are following commands out of discipline rather than conviction begin questioning their superiors, and units that were mobilizing for conflict receive contradictory instructions that expose the fractured chain of authority. The conspirators find themselves isolated at the naval base, surrounded by forces that no longer recognize their authority. Some attempt to flee, others are arrested by their own subordinates. The coup, which depended on speed and control of information, disintegrates once both advantages are lost. Within hours, the crisis that nearly triggered a global war is reduced to a criminal investigation, an internal purge, diplomatic aftermath, and uneasy resolution. In the immediate wake of the crisis, back-channel communications between American and Russian officials work to construct a narrative that allows both sides to step back from the brink without public humiliation. The official story emphasizes cooperation against rogue elements, downplaying the unauthorized presence of U.S. forces in Russian territory and avoiding any language that would inflame nationalist sentiment on either side. Arkansas receives orders to withdraw from the region, escorted partway by Russian vessels in a bizarre display of temporary alliance. The submarine that was, days earlier, a target for destruction is now granted safe passage as a gesture of gratitude for actions that will never be fully disclosed. The men aboard are left with the surreal experience of watching potential enemies provide cover for their departure. Glass and Andropov's parting. Before Arkansas leaves Russian waters, Andropov and the rescued Russian crew are transferred off the boat. The farewell between Glass and the Admiral is brief and loaded with unspoken recognition. They won't meet again, and their cooperation will remain classified for decades, but both men understand they were part of something larger than their own nation's rivalry. Andropov offers a quiet salute not to the uniform, but to the man who made the hard call to save lives when protocol said to leave them behind. Glass returns the gesture, and then the Russian officers depart, disappearing back into their own chain of command while Arkansas turns toward home. Return. Without recognition. When the submarine and the SEAL team finally reach friendly territory, there are no public ceremonies or media coverage. The operation's success is measured precisely in what didn't happen. No war, no nuclear exchange, no catastrophic breakdown in global stability. The sailors and operators involved receive quiet acknowledgments and closed briefings, but their story remains buried under classification stamp. Glass returns to regular duty without fanfare, his actions known only to a small circle of officials who will never be able to publicly credit what he accomplished. The world continues, unaware of how close it came to annihilation, and the professionals who prevented that outcome accept the burden of anonymity as part of the job. Broader implications left unresolved. The film closes without pretending that the underlying tensions between nations have vanished. The coup may have failed, but the conditions that enabled it, Nationalism, distrust, and the dangerous proximity of armed forces operating on hair-trigger alert remain in place. Hunter-Killer suggests that preventing war is not a permanent victory, but a temporary reprieve, one that must be constantly re-earned by individuals willing to choose cooperation over pride. The final images reinforce this ambiguity. Submarines returning to their patrols, politicians resuming their posturing, and the vast, indifferent ocean continuing to hide the silent machines that could end civilization if the wrong people make the wrong calls at the wrong time. If you'd like, we can now move into character analysis, diving deep into Glass, Andropov, Beeman, and the supporting ensemble without recycling any previous description. Joe Glass is built as a commander who doesn't fit the stereotypical image of a polished, academy-groomed officer. He's risen through the ranks by grinding it out in less glamorous assignments, which shapes his attitude toward hierarchy and tradition. That background makes him more flexible than many of his peers. He respects procedure but doesn't worship it, and that difference becomes crucial when he's asked to steer a submarine through a crisis where the handbook has no answers. His leadership style prioritizes listening over barking orders. Rather than projecting dominance for its own sake, he weighs his crew's input, especially from technical specialists whose expertise he knows he lacks. That humility is not framed as weakness. Instead, it's portrayed as the trait that allows him to adapt faster than officers who are locked into rigid doctrine. In a story about systems on the verge of spiraling out of control, he's the rare senior figure who can pivot without losing authority. Glass's moral compass and tactical mind. One of the defining aspects of Glass's character is how he balances conscience and calculation. He doesn't take risks just to seem heroic. He takes them when he believes the cost of inaction will be far worse than the danger in front of him. The decision to rescue enemy survivors exemplifies this balance. He understands the tactical risk of bringing foreign sailors on board, yet he also recognizes the strategic upside of preventing needless deaths and gaining first-hand knowledge of what really happened. This approach carries through every major choice he makes. He never forgets that he's responsible for the lives of everyone on Arkansas, yet he also sees the larger picture in which those lives are part of a wider web of consequences. The film positions him as the person willing to accept responsibility when others hide behind procedure, which quietly distinguishes him from armchair decision-makers who treat conflict like a chess match with replaceable pieces. Glass, as an answer to loose cannon tropes. In many military thrillers, the main officer figure is a rebel who succeeds by defying orders out of sheer instinct or ego. Glass isn't that kind of maverick. He pushes back against instructions only when he can articulate why they're wrong or dangerously incomplete. His defiance is grounded in information rather than raw emotion, which gives his clashes with the chain of command a different flavor. They feel like arguments between professionals with competing assessments, not tantrums from a hothead looking for validation. This makes him more believable as a commander. He doesn't get away with insubordination because the script needs him to be right. He earns leeway because his track record and judgment make it hard to dismiss his perspective. The story uses him to suggest that the ideal leader in a nuclear age isn't the one who charges ahead without doubt, but the one who understands that certainty itself can be hazardous. Andropov, the veteran who knows the cost. Admiral Sergei Andropov serves as the film's most layered Russian figure. He's not portrayed as a cartoon antagonist or as a saintly reformer, but as a career officer who has spent his life inside a system he understands intimately. That experience gives him a clear view of how quickly pride, paranoia, and misinformation can ignite catastrophe when powerful weapons are involved. His time aboard the damaged Russian submarine and subsequent rescue forces him into a position he never expected. Cooperating with the Navy, he spent his career preparing to fight. He bristles at the idea of relying on American help, yet he's pragmatic enough to recognize that refusing would mean abandoning his own crew and country to a faction willing to gamble everything on an engineered crisis. Andropov's quiet influence on the plot. Once he's aboard Arkansas, Andropov becomes a sort of moral and strategic mirror to Glass. They share certain skepticism toward simplistic explanations and aversion to needless killing. But they come from different cultural and institutional backgrounds. Their dialogue is defined by cautious respect rather than instant camaraderie, and that tension makes their eventual cooperation feel earned rather than forced. Andropov's knowledge shifts the narrative trajectory. Without his insight into Russian naval protocols and the psychology of officers following dubious orders, Arkansas would be operating nearly blind. He doesn't just provide technical advice, he frames the coup in terms a foreign commander can understand, explaining how loyalty, fear, and ambition intersect within his country's military structure. That perspective is vital in convincing Glass that the real enemy isn't Russia as a monolith, but a small group twisting that apparatus for personal power. Beeman and the SEAL team. Professionals, not superheroes. Lieutenant Bill Beeman and his SEAL unit are drawn as consummate professionals rather than invincible caricatures. They don't crack endless jokes, and they don't treat combat like a thrill ride. Their competence is shown through the way they plan, communicate, and adjust when circumstances shift. They move like people who know that a single misstep could doom both themselves and a head of state, who represents the only lawful counterweight to the coup. The film gives them distinct but restrained personalities. They have banter, but it's muted, more about focus and trust than about showboating. Their actions emphasize discipline under pressure, checking corners even when exhausted, sticking to the plan until a new situation demands a change, and prioritizing the objective over personal glory. This grounded portrayal aligns with the story's broader theme of unsung professionals holding the world together. Beeman's leadership. Under extreme constraints, Beeman's leadership contrasts with Glass's in interesting ways. On the ground, he can't afford the same degree of deliberation. His timeline is compressed into seconds rather than minutes. He makes decisions with partial information while bullets are flying, yet he still weighs risk versus reward in each move. When he chooses to push forward rather than retreat, it's not because he's reckless, but because he accepts that abandoning the mission would likely cement the coup's success. His relationship with the president during the escape highlights another facet of his character. He's respectful without being deferential to the point of endangering the mission. He treats the head of state like an asset to be protected and moved efficiently, which might sound cold but is, in context, the most effective form of respect, doing everything necessary to keep him alive, even when that means dragging him through gunfire. The coup architect. Ambition in uniform. The defense minister spearheading the coup embodies a particular kind of danger. A leader who confuses personal ambition with national destiny. He presents himself as the only figure strong enough to restore his country's perceived greatness, using familiar language about honor and security to justify actions that clearly place millions at risk. The narrative frames him not as a madman, but as someone who has rationalized every step into believing the ends justify the means. His manipulation of information is central to his power. By controlling communications, he crafts a story in which foreign aggression appears undeniable, even though he manufactured the provocations. The character's menace comes less from physical presence and more from the cold calculation with which he's willing to sacrifice civilians, sailors, and even the legitimacy of his own government to achieve a warped vision of strength. Pentagon and intelligence figure. Power with limits. On the American side, senior officials embody the tension between overwhelming capability and genuine limitation. They command satellites, warships, and special forces, yet they struggle with incomplete information and competing political pressures. Their power doesn't translate into easy solutions. Every possible response carries the risk of escalation, misinterpretation, or domestic fallout. These characters illustrate how bureaucracy and human judgment intersect in crisis. Some lean toward aggressive shows of force, worried that any sign of restraint will be read as weakness. Others insist on caution, aware that misreading a situation in a nuclear world can be irreparable. None of them come across as omniscient puppet masters. Instead, they're portrayed as fallible humans juggling morality, optics, and security in real time. Jane Norquist, Civilian Perspective. In A Military Storm, the intelligence analyst at the center of the American decision-making circle provides a crucial civilian lens on events. She doesn't wear a uniform, but her influence stems from her ability to interpret patterns others might miss. She connects dots between surveillance data, intercepted signals, and ground reports, building a picture of the coup that goes beyond raw metric. Her presence also highlights how non-combat roles can be decisive in conflicts that might never be officially recognized as wars. She advocates for a path that avoids both paralysis and reckless escalation, pushing those around her to see the coup not just as an opportunity to assert dominance, but as a crisis that demands cooperation with unlikely allies. In a room full of brass, she anchors the conversation to broader consequences rather than narrow notions of victory. Supporting crews. As the story's backbone. Beyond the headline roles, Hunter-Killer populates its submarines and special operations units with crew members who function as the story's spine. Sonar operators, navigation specialists, tactical officers, and enlisted sailors all play their parts with a sense of lived-in routine. They react with fear, relief, and professional focus rather than melodrama, making the environment feel like a workplace under extreme stress rather than a set filled with stock archetypes. These background characters matter because they embody the stakes. When the hull creaks or a torpedo locks on, the camera doesn't linger only on the captain's face. It shows the people at consoles whose hearts are on the line, even if history never records their names. That choice reinforces the film's central idea that modern conflict is carried on the shoulders of countless individuals whose contributions rarely make it into official narratives. If you'd like to continue building the essay, next we can move into a dedicated section on technical craft, cinematography, sound design, editing, and how those choices create tension in the submarine and ground sequences. Tom Moraes' camera work establishes distinct visual identities for the film's two primary environments. Inside the submarine, the lens stays tight, often shooting over shoulders or through hatches to emphasize confinement. The lack of establishing shots in these sequences is deliberate. You rarely see the full control room at once, which mirrors the crew's inability to see beyond their immediate surroundings. The framing constantly reminds you that these characters are trapped inside a steel tube surrounded by lethal pressure. In contrast, the land-based SEAL operation opens up the frame when they're outside, using wider compositions to show the expanse of snowy terrain and the isolation of the base. But once they move indoors, the camera adopts a different compression, not the cramped closeness of the submarine, but the sharp angles and narrow sightlines of industrial corridors. This shift in visual language keeps the two storylines distinct while maintaining consistent tension across both. Lighting. As a storytelling tool, the submarine's lighting scheme leans heavily on functional sources, instrument panels, overhead strips, emergency reds. These aren't just aesthetic choices, they're diegetic elements that ground the environment in realism. When Arkansas goes to silent running and dims non-essential systems, the lighting drops with it, plunging sections of the boat into shadow. The audience feels the shift in operational status through color and brightness as much as through dialogue. Above ground, the Russian naval base uses harsh fluorescence and sodium vapor tones that cast sickly yellows and greens across concrete walls. The color palette here evokes Cold War-era infrastructure, utilitarian, aging, oppressive. Natural daylight is sparse and filtered, suggesting an environment designed to control rather than comfort. This visual language reinforces the political themes without needing explicit exposition. Camera movement and stability. During action sequences, the cinematography adopts different strategies depending on context. In firefights and close-quarters combat, the camera stays handheld but controlled, following operators through doorways and around corners with enough shake to convey urgency without descending into incomprehensible chaos. The movement is reactive rather than frenetic, keeping spatial geography legible so viewers can track who's where. Underwater, the camera often stays locked to the submarine's perspective, tilting and rolling with the vessel as it maneuvers. When Arkansas banks hard or dives sharply, the frame rotates accordingly, using a physical gimbal set to create genuine disorientation. This technique avoids the artificiality of actors pretending to stumble on a level soundstage. The environment itself is genuinely unstable, and the camera captures that reality. Sound design, silence, and eruption. The film's audio landscape understands that submarines operate in a world where sound is both weapon and vulnerability. Long stretches play out in near silence, punctuated only by the hum of systems, the creak of metal under stress, and the rhythmic ping of sonar. That quiet isn't peaceful, it's nerve-wracking, because everyone aboard knows that any unexpected noise could reveal their position to hunters circling above. When violence does erupt, the sound design doesn't hold back. Torpedoes detonating underwater create deep, resonant booms that feel less like explosions and more like the ocean itself convulsing. Gunfire in enclosed spaces, both inside the submarine and within base corridors, has an aggressive, metallic punch that emphasizes the danger of ricochets and overpenetration. The contrast between prolonged quiet and sudden violence keeps the audience off balance. Sonar. As auditory drama, the film uses sonar pings and returns as a narrative device in themselves. The sound becomes a character conveying information and building dread. When a distant contact appears on the scope, the audio mix emphasizes the faint, ghostly echo that suggests something massive lurking just beyond detection range. As the contact closes, the pings grow sharper and more frequent, tightening the tension without needing anyone to explain the threat verbally. This approach trusts the audience to understand that sound equals danger in submarine warfare. It also creates a unique kind of suspense. Instead of watching something approach on screen, you're hearing it inch closer through auditory cues that feel both abstract and visceral. The sonar operator's interpretations become life or death readings, and the sound design makes those readings tangible. Editing. Parallel tension, and pacing. The editing structure juggles three simultaneous threads: submarine, ground operation, Pentagon command, without losing momentum or clarity. Cuts between storylines often happen at moments of rising tension in both locations, creating a compounding effect where each thread's urgency amplifies the others. The rhythm avoids predictable back-and-forth patterns. Sometimes a sequence lingers in one location for several minutes, then rapid fires through all three environments in quick succession. This variability keeps the pacing from feeling mechanical. It also allows certain beats to breathe while others accelerate. When Glass is making a critical decision, the edit might hold on his face and the reactions of his crew without cutting away, giving the moment weight. When Beeman's team is breaching a building, the cuts come faster, matching the operational tempo and creating a sense of barely controlled chaos. Cross-cutting during the climax. As the rescue mission reaches its peak, the editing weaves all storylines into a single escalating sequence. The film cuts between SEALs fighting through the base, Arkansas evading detection, and command centers on both sides, issuing orders based on incomplete information. The technique creates a sense that time is collapsing, that decisions made in one location have immediate consequences elsewhere, even if the characters can't see those connections. This structural choice underscores the film's thematic interest in interconnected systems. No single character controls the outcome. Instead, success depends on multiple people executing their roles under pressure and trusting that others are doing the same. The editing visually represents that fragile interdependence by refusing to let any one storyline dominate the climax. Production design, authenticity, in confined spaces. The submarine interior built for the film prioritizes functional density over sleek futurism. Every surface is covered with pipes, valves, gauges, and labeled controls. The set doesn't look like a designer's vision of a submarine. It looks like a machine built by engineers who prioritize reliability and efficiency over comfort. That tangible realism helps sell the danger. This is not a fictional spaceship where damage is abstract, but a real-world vessel, where a single breach means water flooding in at killing pressure. The Russian naval base uses a different design philosophy. Its architecture is blocky and imposing, with wide concrete hallways, heavy steel doors, and utilitarian fixtures that suggest decades of minimal maintenance. The spaces feel institutional and oppressive, reinforcing the sense that this is a place where individual agency is subordinated to hierarchical control. The aesthetic supports the narrative by making the base feel like an extension of the authoritarian impulses driving the coup. The gimbal set and physical immersion. One of the film's standout technical achievements is the decision to build the submarine interior on a hydraulic gimbal capable of tilting and rotating. This allows the set itself to move in sync with the submarine's maneuvers, creating genuine physical effects that actors respond to instinctively. When Arkansas banks sharply, crew members actually slide across the deck or brace against consoles, eliminating the unconvincing pantomime that often plagues submarine films shot on stationary sets. This choice has cascading effects on performance. Actors don't have to imagine the sensation of a diving submarine. They feel the deck tilting beneath them, the shift in equilibrium, the sudden lurch when the boat levels off. That physical reality translates directly into more believable reactions, and the camera captures those authentic responses without needing to rely on digital trickery or exaggerated acting. Visual effects, enhancing rather than replacing. The film uses visual effects primarily to extend practical environments rather than create fully synthetic ones. Exterior submarine shots blend miniature work, CGI, and underwater photography to depict vessels moving through Arctic waters. The approach prioritizes weight and scale. The submarines feel massive and deliberate, not nimble or cartoonish. Water displacement, wake patterns, and lighting all contribute to a sense that these are real objects subject to physical laws. For sequences involving torpedoes and underwater explosions, the effects work focuses on conveying the violence of compressed energy release in a dense medium. Explosions don't look like surface-level fireballs. They register as shock waves and pressure fronts that distort and shatter. This restraint keeps the action grounded, avoiding the temptation to turn every impact into a spectacle divorced from the physics of the setting. Music and score, underscoring, without overwhelming. The film's score, composed by Trevor Morris, operates mostly in the background, using low strings, muted brass, and electronic textures to build unease without calling attention to itself. During dialogue-heavy command center scenes, the music often drops out entirely, letting the actors' voices and the ambient hum of equipment carry the tension. This restraint prevents the score from telegraphing emotions or preemptively signaling danger. When the music does swell during the final confrontation or the extraction sequence, it's earned rather than manipulative. The orchestration emphasizes momentum and scale, supporting the visuals without dictating how the audience should feel. The score understands that, in a film about professionals managing crises, loud emotional cues would undermine the grounded tone the rest of the filmmaking establishes. Environmental sound. as musical element. Beyond traditional score, the film treats mechanical and environmental sounds almost musically. The rhythmic thrum of the submarine's reactor, the echoing drip of condensation, the distant groan of ice pressing against the hull, all of these become part of the auditory texture that defines the underwater world. In quieter moments, this layered soundscape creates its own rhythm, a reminder that even in apparent calm, the environment is hostile and unforgiving. Above the surface, wind, distant machinery, and the crunch of boots on snow serve a similar function. These sounds aren't incidental, they're woven into the mix to create a sense of place and atmosphere. The cumulative effect is immersive. You're not just watching characters move through environments, you're experiencing those environments as sensory spaces. Technical choices, serving narrative, themes, all of these craft elements work in service of the film's central concerns: the fragility of systems under stress, the importance of competence and communication, and the thin margin between control and catastrophe. The cinematography's claustrophobia mirrors the character's lack of maneuvering room, both literal and metaphorical. The sound design's emphasis on silence and sudden violence reflects the hair-trigger nature of nuclear-age conflict. The editing's interwoven timelines visualize the interconnected consequences of individual decisions. These aren't just technical achievements for their own sake, they're deliberate choices that reinforce the story being told. The filmmaking asks you to feel the pressure, hear the danger, and understand the stakes through sensory experience as much as through plot and dialogue. If you'd like to continue, next we can explore the film's thematic layers: nationalism, cooperation, the ethics of intervention, and what it says about modern geopolitics, all with fresh analysis. Hunter Killer engages with nationalism, not as an inherent evil, but as a force that can be weaponized by those who understand its power. The coup architects exploit patriotic language and historical grievances to justify their seizure of authority, framing their actions as necessary to restore national pride. The film shows how easily legitimate concerns about sovereignty and respect can be twisted into justifications for aggression when ambitious figures control the narrative. What makes this portrayal effective is its refusal to present nationalism as uniquely dangerous in one country while ignoring it in another. American characters also operate within frameworks of national interest and strategic dominance, and the film doesn't pretend that U.S. involvement in the crisis is purely altruistic. Both sides are driven by a mix of genuine security concerns and the desire to project strength, and the story's tension arises from the question of whether those impulses can be managed or whether they inevitably spiral into violence. The myth of the monolithic enemy. One of the film's quieter themes is its dismantling of the idea that nations act as unified entities with single wills. The coup itself is evidence that Russia isn't one thing. It's a collection of institutions, officers, and officials with competing loyalties and interpretations of duty. Andropov and the president represent one vision of Russian identity, while the defense minister represents another, and the conflict between them reveals the internal contradictions that exist within any large power structure. This complexity extends to the American side as well. Pentagon officials argue among themselves about the appropriate response, intelligence analysts push back against military instincts, and field operators make decisions that don't always align with what policymakers intended. The film suggests that the real danger isn't us versus them, but the gap between what leaders think they're ordering and what actually happens when those orders meet reality. Cooperation as pragmatism, not idealism. The alliance between Glass and Andropov isn't framed as a triumph of universal brotherhood or the power of friendship. It's presented as a calculated recognition that both men have more to lose from conflict than they have to gain from hostility. They cooperate because the alternative, letting the coup succeed and watching the situation collapse into war, serves neither of their actual interests, regardless of what their respective governments might prefer in the abstract. This pragmatic framing gives the collaboration weight. It's not that Glass suddenly decides Russians are good people, or that Andropov concludes Americans can be trusted. It's that both recognize the specific individuals they're dealing with share a common goal in this moment, and that shared goal is more urgent than their broader geopolitical rivalry. The film uses this dynamic to argue that cooperation doesn't require liking or trusting your counterpart, it just requires a clear-eyed assessment of incentives. The ethics of unauthorized intervention. The decision to rescue the Russian president raises uncomfortable questions about sovereignty and intervention. The United States, operating without permission from any legitimate Russian authority, sends armed forces into foreign territory to extract a head of state. On paper, this is an act of war. The film doesn't shy away from that reality, but it frames the dilemma in terms of competing evils: commit a technical violation of sovereignty or allow a nuclear-armed state to fall under the control of leaders who are actively seeking conflict. This ethical knot doesn't get neatly resolved. The mission succeeds and war is averted, which seems to justify the decision in hindsight. But the film also acknowledges that success doesn't erase the precedent. If intervention is acceptable when the stakes are high enough, who decides when those stakes have been reached? And what prevents that logic from being abused by future leaders with less noble intentions? The story raises these questions without offering easy answers, trusting the audience to grapple with the implications. Authority versus legitimacy. The coup plotters hold positions of authority within the Russian military hierarchy, which allows them to issue orders that are technically lawful in form. Yet the film clearly distinguishes between authority, the formal power to command, and legitimacy, which derives from alignment with lawful process and national interest. The defense minister can give orders, but those orders lack moral weight because they serve personal ambition rather than the nation he claims to represent. This distinction matters because it forces characters to choose between obedience and conscience. Officers who follow the coup's commands are not portrayed as villains. They're shown as people trying to navigate a system where clarity has broken down. The real test of character comes when individuals must decide whether to keep following orders that feel wrong or to risk punishment by acting on their own judgment. The film suggests that in moments of institutional failure, personal integrity becomes the only reliable guide. The submarine. As microcosm, life aboard Arkansas serves as a concentrated version of the film's broader themes. The submarine is a society in miniature, where survival depends on cooperation, competence, and trust. Every crew member has a specific role, and failure in any one position can doom everyone. This interdependence creates a natural meritocracy. Rank matters, but so does skill. And Glass's willingness to listen to his sonar operator or engineer reflects an understanding that hierarchy can't replace expertise. The presence of rescued Russian sailors aboard the submarine intensifies this dynamic. The Americans can't simply segregate them or treat them as prisoners without creating internal chaos. Instead, they're forced into a fragile coexistence where former enemies share tight quarters and limited resources. The film uses this setting to explore how quickly hostility can shift to cooperation when everyone recognizes they're in the same lifeboat, and how that recognition might apply to the larger geopolitical context. By jamming signals, isolating the president, and managing what reaches Russian commanders, the conspirators create a reality where their version of events becomes the only one available. This manipulation highlights the fragility of democratic and institutional safeguards in an age where information flows can be disrupted or corrupted by insiders with technical access. The film's resolution hinges on breaking that monopoly. Once the president's voice reaches loyalist officers, the narrative collapses because it can be checked against an authoritative source. This arc subtly emphasizes that truth isn't self-evident. It requires mechanisms to transmit and verify it, and those mechanisms are vulnerable to sabotage. The story suggests that protecting information integrity is as crucial to preventing conflict as maintaining strong defenses. Restraint as strength, not weakness. Throughout the film, characters face pressure to demonstrate toughness through aggressive action. Hawks in the Pentagon want to respond forcefully to Russian movements, and the coup plotters expect that any American president will react with escalation, giving them the pretext they need. Glass's refusal to sink the Russian submarine outright or to abandon survivors initially looks like softness that could cost him. But the narrative ultimately validates restraint as the harder and more effective choice. By refusing to fit the role his enemies expect, Glass denies them the story they need to justify their actions. His willingness to absorb risk without immediately retaliating creates space for alternatives that wouldn't exist if he defaulted to maximum force. The film quietly argues that in a world where mistakes can be irreversible, the ability to hold back is a form of power, not a surrender of it. Unsung professionalism versus public heroism. The film closes with the recognition that the people who prevented disaster will receive no public acclaim. Their success is measured in the absence of catastrophe, which by definition makes it invisible to anyone outside classified briefing. This stands in contrast to traditional military narratives where heroism is rewarded with medals, promotions, and public gratitude. Hunter Killer treats that invisibility as both a burden and a necessity. The operators involved understand that going public would create diplomatic nightmares and potentially undermine the fragile stability they fought to preserve. Their willingness to accept anonymity reflects a particular kind of professionalism, doing the job because it needs doing, not because it will lead to recognition. The film respects that ethos even as it acknowledges the psychological cost of carrying secrets that can never be shared. Geopolitics, as human decisions, not abstract forces. Underlying all these themes is a commitment to depicting geopolitics as the product of individual choices rather than impersonal historical forces. Wars don't start because of inevitable clashes of civilizations or deterministic economic pressures. They start because specific people in positions of power make decisions, and those decisions are influenced by pride, fear, ambition, and miscalculation. By focusing on individuals, Glass, Andropov, Beeman, the president, the coup leaders, the film rejects fatalism. It suggests that even in systems as large and complex as global military power structures, the actions of single actors can still tip outcomes. This perspective doesn't ignore structural factors, but it insists that agency exists even within constraining circumstances, and that the choices people make in crisis moments genuinely matter. The fragility of peace. The film's final thematic note is a recognition that peace isn't a stable default state, but an ongoing achievement that requires constant effort. The crisis is resolved, but the conditions that enabled it, military rivalry, nationalist sentiment, institutional vulnerabilities, remain in place. The world returns to a state of managed tension rather than genuine resolution, and the story acknowledges that preventing the next crisis will require another generation of professionals willing to make difficult calls under pressure. This sobering conclusion resists the temptation to suggest that one successful mission has fixed the underlying problems. Instead, it frames the work of preventing catastrophe as cyclical and thankless, something that must be done repeatedly by people who will rarely see lasting results. The film honors that reality without descending into nihilism, suggesting that even temporary victories are worth the effort when the alternative is unthinkable. If you'd like to keep building the essay, next we can move into the film's reception, cultural impact, and legacy, how it was received, what it says about its historical moment, and how it fits within the broader genre landscape. Hunter Killer arrived in theaters on October 26, 2018, entering a marketplace dominated by franchise tentpoles and established superhero properties. The film carried a reported production budget of $40 million and faced the uphill challenge of selling an original military thriller, adapted from a novel, but without built-in brand recognition, to audiences increasingly drawn to serialized universes and familiar IP. Domestically, the film struggled to find traction, earning just under $16 million across its entire U.S. theatrical run. International markets proved more receptive, pushing the global total to approximately $31 million. But the final numbers still fell short of what would be considered a commercial success by traditional studio metric. This performance wasn't a catastrophic failure, but it confirmed what many industry observers already suspected. Mid-budget action thrillers aimed at adult audiences face significant headwinds in an exhibition landscape optimized for four-quadrant spectacles. Critical reception, competent but unexceptional reviews, landed in a narrow band between appreciation for professional execution and criticism of formulaic storytelling. Rotten Tomatoes aggregated a 37% critical score, with the consensus acknowledging the film's technical craft while noting that it rarely transcended genre convention. Critics who responded positively tended to praise the performances, particularly Butler's grounded turn and Nike Vist's final role, and the production's commitment to practical submarine interiors. Detractors pointed to a perceived lack of originality, arguing that the film borrowed heavily from better-known submarine thrillers without adding sufficient innovation to justify revisiting familiar territory. Some reviews highlighted moments of implausible plotting or overly convenient resolutions, particularly in how smoothly international cooperation materializes once the right people are in the same room. The split in critical response reflects a broader tension in genre filmmaking. Audiences and critics often have different standards for what constitutes good enough in an action thriller. Audience response, genre fans, versus broader public viewer ratings told a somewhat different story than critical assessments. On platforms where general audiences score films, Hunter Killer received more favorable marks, suggesting that those who sought out a military action thriller largely got what they wanted. The film delivered submarine tension, international intrigue, and competent action set pieces, which satisfied genre enthusiasts even if it didn't convert skeptics who weren't predisposed to this kind of storytelling. This gap between critical and audience reception highlights how genre expectations shape evaluation. Critics, watching dozens of films across all categories, are more likely to penalize familiar beats and predictable arcs. Audiences specifically seeking submarine warfare or military procedural content are more forgiving of convention if the execution meets professional standards. Neither perspective is wrong, they're simply optimized for different criteria. Historical context, post-Cold War. Pre-pandemic, geopolitics. The film's 2018 release positioned it at a particular moment in global politics. Tensions between the United States and Russia had escalated following the annexation of Crimea, election interference allegations, and proxy conflicts in Syria. Yet unlike the clear ideological divide of the Cold War, the contemporary relationship was messier, marked by economic interdependence, competing nationalisms, and ambiguity about whether Russia was an adversary, a rival, or something in between. Hunter-Killer navigates this ambiguity by making the villain a faction within Russia rather than the nation itself. This choice allows the film to engage with real anxieties about authoritarian impulses and nuclear brinksmanship while avoiding a simplistic good country versus bad country frame that would have felt dated. The story acknowledges that both superpowers have interests and institutions that don't always align internally, which reflects the multipolar complexity of 2010's geopolitics more accurately than binary Cold War frameworks. The submarine thriller's evolution. The film exists within a lineage of submarine warfare cinema that stretches from Das Boot, 1981, through The Hunt for Red October, 1990, and Crimson Tide, 1995. Each of those predecessors succeeded by using the submarine setting to explore larger themes: the horror of war, the ethics of defection, the tension between following orders and exercising judgment. Hunter-Killer attempts similar moves, but it arrived in an era when the novelty of the setting had diminished and audiences had internalized the visual and narrative language of underwater warfare. What Hunter-Killer adds to the genre is a dual-front structure that splits focus between submarine operations and land-based special forces action. This hybrid approach aims to address a potential limitation of pure submarine thrillers, the lack of visual variety and physical action, by interweaving ground combat and geopolitical maneuvering. The trade-off is that neither thread receives the sustained focus that might have made it truly memorable, but the strategy does keep the pacing more dynamic than a single-location underwater thriller might allow. Michael Nyqvist's final performance. One element that adds retrospective significance to Hunter-Killer is that it features one of the last performances by Swedish actor Michael Nyqvist, who passed away in 2017 before the film's release. Nyqvist, best known internationally for his role in the original Girl with the Dragon Tattoo trilogy, brings gravitas and weariness to Admiral Andropov. His portrayal avoids cliché, presenting the Russian officer as a man shaped by decades of service, rather than as a one-dimensional antagonist or convenient ally. Knowing this was among his final roles adds an unintended poignancy to Andropov's arc. The character's journey from presumed enemy to reluctant partner, from officer following doctrine to individual making moral choices, resonates differently when viewed as a capstone to an actor's career. Nyqvist's performance anchors the film's thematic interest in bridge building and pragmatic cooperation, and his absence from the promotional cycle likely diminished the film's ability to capitalize on his presence in marketing. Genre films. In the streaming transition, Hunter-Killer arrived at the tail end of an era when mid-budget genre films could still expect meaningful theatrical distribution. Within 2 years, the COVID-19 pandemic would accelerate the industry's shift towards streaming-first releases for precisely this type of project. Films with comparable scope and subject matter increasingly bypass theaters or receive limited runs before moving quickly to digital platforms where they can find niche audiences without competing directly against blockbuster tentpoles. In this context, Hunter-Killer represents a kind of last generation of theatrical military thrillers. Its modest box office performance likely reinforced studio decisions to redirect similar projects towards streaming services, where success metrics are less transparent and where genre films can accumulate viewership over time rather than needing to dominate on opening weekend. The film's afterlife on home video and streaming platforms may ultimately reach a larger audience than its theatrical run, though that success is harder to quantify. Comparison. To Tom Clancy's universe, reviewers frequently invoked Tom Clancy when discussing Hunter-Killer, and the comparison is instructive. Clancy's novels and their adaptation, The Hunt for Red October, Patriot Games, Clear and Present Danger, established a template for techno-thrillers that blend military procedural detail with geopolitical intrigue. Hunter-Killer clearly operates within that tradition, emphasizing operational competence, hardware authenticity, and scenarios where professionals prevent wars through skill and judgment. Where Hunter-Killer diverges from the Clancy model is in scale and character depth. Clancy's best-known stories feature iconic recurring protagonists like Jack Ryan, whose moral clarity and institutional savvy anchor multi-layered plots. Hunter-Killer offers competent professionals rather than larger-than-life heroes, and its plot, while complex, lacks the intricate web of subplots and international chess moves that define Clancy's densest work. It's a leaner, more streamlined take on similar material, which works for a 2-hour film but may have contributed to perceptions that it lacked the heft of its literary influences. The appeal of competent narratives. One reason Hunter-Killer found an audience despite its modest box office is its positioning within what some cultural critics call competence porn, stories that derive pleasure from watching skilled professionals execute complex tasks under pressure. In an era marked by political dysfunction, institutional failure, and widespread skepticism about expertise, narratives that depict people who are genuinely good at their jobs offer a kind of escapist reassurance. Glass and his crew, Beam SEAL team, even Andropov, all are portrayed as individuals who know their roles, execute them with precision, and solve problems through skill rather than luck or superhuman abilities. For viewers exhausted by incompetence in public life, watching fictional professionals calmly navigate life-or-death crises can be deeply satisfying, even if the story around them is formulaic. This appeal may explain why audience scores remain higher than critical ones. The film delivers on the promise of watching experts work, which matters more to some viewers than narrative innovation. Limited cultural footprint. Unlike The Hunt for Red October, which spawned catchphrases and became a cultural touchstone, or Crimson Tide, which sparked debates about military ethics, Hunter-Killer left a minimal imprint on popular culture. It generated no viral moments, no widely quoted lines, and no sustained discourse about its themes. This isn't necessarily a failing. Most films, even well-executed ones, fade quickly in a saturated media environment, but it does mark the difference between competent genre work and something that transcends its category. The film's lack of cultural resonance may stem partly from timing. Released between election cycles, without a clear connection to immediate headline crises, and competing against more visible releases, it simply didn't find the cultural moment where its themes would feel urgent. Had it arrived during a different news cycle, perhaps amid a real-world U.S.-Russia confrontation or a high-profile coup attempt, it might have gained traction as a reference point for understanding current events. Instead, it became one more entry in a crowded genre, appreciated by those who found it, but not prominent enough to shape broader conversations. Technical achievement versus narrative innovation. If there's a consensus in both critical and audience responses, it's that Hunter-Killer succeeds more as a technical exercise than as a narrative breakthrough. The submarine sets, the gimbal work, the sound design, the cinematography, all meet or exceed industry standards for this type of production. The performances are solid, the action coherent, the pacing adequate. What the film doesn't offer is a fresh perspective on its subject matter, or a story structure that surprises. This gap between craft and originality reflects a broader challenge in contemporary genre filmmaking. As production techniques mature and audiences become more sophisticated, the bar for technical competence rises, but technical excellence alone doesn't guarantee cultural impact or commercial success. Films need hooks, whether conceptual, thematic, or character-driven, that distinguish them from everything else competing for attention. Hunter-Killer delivers professional work without a compelling reason for audiences to prioritize it over alternatives. The film's afterlife and ongoing relevance. Despite its underwhelming theatrical performance, Hunter-Killer continues to find audiences through streaming platforms, cable broadcasts, and digital rentals. In this secondary market, freed from the pressure to compete against blockbusters for screen space, it serves a steady demand for military action thrillers from viewers seeking familiar genre pleasures. Its relevance persists in part because the geopolitical tensions it dramatizes haven't disappeared. U.S.-Russia relations remain fraught, nuclear arsenals still pose existential risks, and the possibility of coups or authoritarian takeovers continues to generate headlines worldwide. The film's modesty may actually aid its longevity in this context, because it doesn't stake its identity on topical references or specific political figures. It ages more gracefully than thrillers tied to particular administrations or crises. It remains a functional piece of genre entertainment, neither a classic nor a disaster, but a competent example of a storytelling tradition that continues to attract dedicated audiences even as the theatrical landscape shifts around it. If you'd like to continue, next we can craft a closing section that reflects on the film's place in cinema, what it reveals about the state of action thrillers, and why it matters, or doesn't, in the broader landscape of military storytelling. All fresh material to wrap up the essay. The film's existence speaks to a particular tension in contemporary Hollywood, the desire to produce grounded, adult-oriented action thrillers in an industry increasingly structured around IP franchises and spectacle-driven tentpoles. Hunter-Killer doesn't chase the Marvel formula or attempt to launch a cinematic universe. It tells a self-contained story aimed at viewers who remember when studios regularly greenlit films like this, submarine dramas, techno-thrillers, military procedurals, without requiring them to set up sequels or cross-promotional opportunities. That approach feels almost quaint in retrospect. The film's modest returns and limited cultural footprint suggest that the market for this kind of standalone genre work has narrowed considerably, at least in theatrical terms. Yet the fact that it was made at all, with a $40 million budget and recognizable stars, indicates that some appetite still exists, or at least existed in the mid-2010s development cycle, for stories that prioritize craft and professionalism over universe building and post-credit teases. The value of workmanlike genre cinema. There's a tendency in film criticism to privilege innovation and subversion, to celebrate works that challenge conventions or redefine categories. That lens can make a film like Hunter Killer feel disposable, since it largely operates within established parameters rather than pushing against them. But there's an underappreciated value in genre films that simply execute their brief competently, delivering what audiences expect with skill and efficiency. Not every film needs to reinvent the wheel. Sometimes a well-constructed thriller that understands its audience and delivers consistent tension is enough. Hunter Killer represents that kind of workmanlike cinema, made by professionals who respect the genre, understand its mechanics, and commit to doing it properly even if they're not aiming to transcend it. In an era where many big-budget films feel assembled by committee or shaped by algorithm, there's something refreshing about a straightforward story told with clarity and purpose. The submarine, as enduring metaphor. Part of why submarine films keep getting made, despite the challenge of creating visual variety in confined spaces, is that the setting functions as a powerful metaphor. The submarine represents isolation, interdependence, and the stakes of modern technological warfare. It's a space where hierarchy and expertise must coexist, where mistakes have no forgiveness, and where the outside world is both omnipresent and invisible. Hunter Killer leverages these metaphorical dimensions without overplaying them. The submarine isn't just a setting, it's a proving ground for Glass's leadership style, a pressure cooker that forces Americans and Russians into unwanted proximity, and a physical embodiment of the fragile systems that keep global conflict in check. The film trusts the inherent drama of the environment rather than trying to force artificial meaning onto it, which gives the submarine sequences a grounded intensity that more self-conscious films might lack. Geopolitical thrillers. In a polarized age, the film navigates a tricky ideological space. It has to acknowledge real tensions between nuclear powers without either whitewashing American foreign policy or demonizing entire nations. The solution, making internal factions rather than countries the primary antagonists, allows for a story that engages with geopolitical anxiety while sidestepping the trap of simple propaganda. This nuance may have limited the film's appeal. Audiences seeking clear-cut heroes and villains, or those looking for stories that confirm their existing political priors, might find Hunter Killer frustratingly balanced. It doesn't offer the catharsis of watching Americans dominate foreign adversaries, nor does it provide the moral complexity of films that interrogate U.S. militarism. Instead, it occupies a middle ground where both sides have legitimate interests and internal divisions, and where preventing disaster requires uncomfortable cooperation. The absence of easy triumphalism. One of the film's more interesting choices is its refusal to end on a note of unambiguous victory. The mission succeeds, the president is rescued, the coup fails, but the closing scenes emphasize secrecy, anonymity, and the understanding that similar crises will recur. There are no crowds cheering, no presidential commendations delivered on camera, no sense that the world has fundamentally changed. This muted conclusion reflects a more mature understanding of how international crises actually resolve. Success often looks like returning to the status quo rather than achieving transformation. The professionals involved don't get celebrated because their work depends on remaining invisible. The film respects that reality, even though it makes for a less emotionally satisfying ending, trusting that viewers can appreciate a conclusion grounded in how the world actually works rather than how we might wish it to. Gerard Butler's career and genre. Positioning for Butler, Hunter Killer represents a continuation of his post-300 career strategy, anchoring mid-budget action films that showcase his physicality and grounded presence without requiring the commitment of a long-term franchise. He's carved out a niche as a reliable lead for exactly this kind of project: military thrillers, disaster films, intense procedurals that appeal to a specific demographic often underserved by tentpole releases. His performance here plays to those strengths. Glass isn't a witty quipster or a tortured anti-hero. He's a competent professional who solves problems through skill and judgment. Butler's everyman quality, his lack of slick movie star polish, makes that characterization believable. He's not trying to be Tom Cruise or Dwayne Johnson. He's occupying a space closer to Harrison Ford in K-19 or Denzel Washington in Crimson Tide, actors who can carry military dramas through presence and credibility rather than spectacle. technical craft. As the film's legacy, if Hunter-Killer endures in any meaningful way, it will likely be as a reference point for submarine interior design and gimbal work. The decision to build a fully functional, tilting submarine set represents a commitment to practical filmmaking that's increasingly rare in an effects-heavy industry. Film students and production designers studying how to create believable military environments will find value in examining how the film's physical sets contribute to performance and immersion. This technical legacy may seem modest compared to cultural impact or box office dominance, but it's a genuine contribution to the craft of filmmaking. The techniques used here, the gimbal construction, the lighting schemes, the sound design approach, offer solutions to challenges that future submarine films will face. In that sense, Hunter-Killer becomes part of the ongoing conversation about how to shoot confined, high-stakes environments in ways that feel authentic rather than staged. The mid-budget action film's uncertain future. Looking at Hunter-Killer from several years out, it's tempting to see it as part of a vanishing category. The mid-budget action thriller, neither cheap enough to be low-risk nor expensive enough to dominate the marketplace, occupies an increasingly precarious position. Studios are less willing to gamble $30–50 million on original stories when streaming platforms offer alternative paths to audiences and when theatrical exhibition favors either massive spectacles or micro-budget horror. Yet the persistence of demand for this kind of storytelling suggests that the category won't disappear entirely. It's simply migrating to different distribution models. Streaming services produce military thrillers, submarine dramas, and geopolitical procedurals with regularity, even if they don't trumpet them as theatrical events. Hunter-Killer may represent the end of one era of distribution rather than the end of audience interest in these stories. The films will keep getting made, they'll just reach viewers differently. Why? Professionalism matters. In storytelling, at its core, Hunter-Killer is a film about professionals doing their jobs under extreme pressure. That thematic focus extends beyond the narrative to the filmmaking itself. The crew built complex sets, the actors trained for physical authenticity, the sound designers crafted intricate audio landscapes, the editors wove multiple storylines into coherent wholes. Every department executed their responsibilities with competence, even if the final product didn't achieve greatness. There's something fitting about that alignment between theme and execution. A film celebrating unsung professionals who prevent disasters without recognition is itself a professional product that may not receive acclaim but fulfills its function. The parallel isn't perfect. The characters save the world, while the filmmakers deliver entertainment. But both operate in realms where doing the work properly matters more than seeking glory. The story we keep telling ourselves: submarine thrillers, military procedurals, and geopolitical crisis films persist because they tap into anxieties that never fully disappear. As long as nuclear weapons exist, as long as superpowers maintain rival interests, as long as communication can fail and pride can override prudence, there will be an audience for stories about narrowly averted catastrophes. These narratives offer a controlled way to process fears about how close we might be to disaster, while also providing reassurance that competent people are working to prevent it. Hunter-Killer participates in that tradition without claiming to transcend it. It acknowledges that the threats are real, that the systems designed to manage them are fragile, and that individuals still matter even within vast institutional structures. Whether the film fully succeeds in exploring those ideas is debatable, but its willingness to engage with them seriously, to treat military professionals with respect, to avoid cheap jingoism, to recognize complexity, gives it more substance than its modest reputation might suggest. Final reflection. A film out of time. Perhaps the most interesting thing about Hunter-Killer is how it feels slightly out of step with its moment. It's too earnest for the irony. Soaked 2010s, too grounded for the spectacle-driven blockbuster era, too conventional for the auteur-focused prestige market. It exists in a gap between what mainstream Hollywood prioritizes and what niche audiences actively seek, which may explain both its commercial underperformance and its persistent appeal to those who discover it. Films that don't fit neatly into their era's dominant modes sometimes age better than those that define them. Hunter-Killer doesn't try to be the next Inception or the next Avengers. It's content to be a solid submarine thriller with a geopolitical twist, made with care and aimed at viewers who still value that kind of storytelling. Whether that's enough depends entirely on what you're looking for, but there's integrity in the effort, in making the film you believe in, rather than chasing trends that may already be obsolete by the time you finish. In the end, Hunter-Killer is a reminder that cinema exists on a spectrum between art and craft, between innovation and tradition, between the films that change everything and the films that simply do their job well. Not every movie can be a masterpiece, and not every story needs to reinvent its genre. Sometimes, a well-executed thriller about professionals preventing a war is exactly what it needs to be: competent, watchable, and ultimately forgettable in the best sense, entertaining for 2 hours, then making room for whatever comes next. The submarines return to their patrols. The professionals go back to work. The world continues, unaware of what almost happened. And somewhere, on a streaming service or a cable channel, Hunter Killer finds its audience, one viewer at a time, in the quiet hours when you want to watch skilled people solve impossible problems, and when that's all the story you need. Director Donovan Marsh came to Hunter Killer with a background in South African cinema, including the underwater thriller Robe 2007 and the gritty crime drama I Number 2013. His filmography prior to this project demonstrated technical competence and a willingness to work within genre frameworks, but he wasn't a household name with an established visual signature like a Tony Scott or Catherine Bigelow. This relative anonymity may have actually served the project, allowing the material and ensemble to take center stage rather than being filtered through a strong auteurist lens. Marsh's approach to Hunter Killer emphasizes clarity over stylistic flourish. His framing choices prioritize spatial legibility, ensuring that even in chaotic action sequences, viewers can track geography and understand what's happening. This discipline extends to pacing. The film moves efficiently without feeling rushed, allowing dramatic beats to land while maintaining forward momentum. There's little evidence of directorial ego intruding on the storytelling. No showy crane shots that exist purely for visual impact. No self-conscious editing tricks that call attention to technique rather than serving narrative. What Marsh brings to the material is a respect for procedure and detail. Scenes set in control rooms, whether aboard submarines or in Pentagon command centers, capture the rhythm of institutional decision-making, the way information flows through hierarchies, how questions get posed and answered, the small rituals that structure high-pressure environments. These sequences could easily feel static or exposition, heavy, but Marsh stages them with enough visual and auditory variation to maintain engagement. He understands that watching professionals work can be inherently dramatic if you allow audiences to appreciate the stakes and complexity of their tasks. Performance dynamics. Butler's restraint and ensemble. Balance. Gerard Butler's work as Joe Glass operates in a lower register than many of his other action roles. There's no growling intensity here, no moments where he unleashes barely controlled rage. Instead, Butler plays Glass as someone who's learned that command isn't about dominating a room, but about making the people around you better at their jobs. His line deliveries are often quiet, almost conversational, which forces other actors to lean in rather than waiting for him to fill space with volume. This restraint creates an interesting performance dynamic aboard the Arkansas. The crew members aren't playing off a larger-than-life captain. They're interacting with someone whose authority comes from competence and consistency. That choice ripples through the ensemble, allowing supporting actors like Carter McIntyre as XO Brian Edwards and Zane Holtz as sonar operator John Norquist, not to be confused with Jane Norquist, the NSA analyst, to build their characters as individuals with agency rather than as props reacting to the hero's charisma. Butler's physical performance also deserves attention. He moves through the submarine set with the careful economy of someone accustomed to tight spaces, never wildly gesturing or sprawling across consoles the way actors often do when they're uncomfortable in a confined environment. That body awareness, likely honed through preparation with naval consultants, adds layers of authenticity that dialogue alone couldn't provide. When Glass grips a railing during a hard turn or steadies himself against a bulkhead, those movements feel instinctive rather than choreographed. Michael Nyqvist's Andropov layers beneath the uniform. Nyqvist's portrayal of Admiral Andropov works because he avoids playing the character as either a villain who reforms or a secret ally waiting to be discovered. From his first moments aboard Arkansas, soaked, injured, uncertain whether he's been rescued or captured, Nyqvist projects wariness and calculation. He's assessing Glass the way Glass is assessing him, and Nyqvist allows that mutual evaluation to unfold gradually rather than telegraphing Andropov's eventual cooperation. There's a particular moment, relatively minor in the grand scheme of the plot, where Andropov watches the American crew working and allows himself a small, barely perceptible nod of professional respect. It's not a big, dramatic beat. It's the kind of detail that could easily be cut or overlooked, but it speaks volumes about Nyqvist's approach to the role. He understands that Andropov's arc isn't about suddenly liking the Americans or rejecting his own country. It's about recognizing shared values around professionalism and duty that transcend national boundaries. Nyqvist's scenes with Butler carry an undercurrent of tension that never fully dissipates, even after they've aligned against the coup. There's always a sense that this alliance is provisional, that circumstances have temporarily overridden deeper loyalties, and that both men understand the fragility of their cooperation. That complexity gives their interactions weight. These aren't two old friends discovering common ground, but two adversaries finding a narrow path toward a shared goal while knowing they'll return to opposite sides once the immediate crisis passes. Common's Beeman, the professional operator archetype. Lonnie Rashid Lynn, performing under his stage name Common, brings a different energy to Lieutenant Bill Beeman. Unlike Glass, who must balance command authority with collaborative instincts, Beeman operates in an environment where orders are executed with minimal debate. The SEAL team functions as a precision instrument, and Beeman is the hand guiding it. Common's performance reflects that reality. He's focused, economical with words, and entirely task-oriented. What makes Beeman interesting as a character is precisely what makes him challenging to portray: his lack of overt conflict or doubt. He doesn't question the mission, doesn't agonize over orders, and doesn't have a personal stake beyond professional responsibility. In less capable hands, that could render him a blank slate. But Common imbues Beeman with an intensity that comes from absolute commitment. When he makes tactical decisions, you see the calculation happening behind his eyes, not tortured deliberation, but rapid assessment and execution. The physical demands of the role, the infiltration sequences, the firefights, the extraction under pressure, require Common to perform extended action choreography while maintaining Beeman's unflappable demeanor. He moves through hostile environments with practiced efficiency, and his interactions with the team emphasize communication and coordination rather than heroic individualism. This ensemble approach to the SEAL sequences reinforces the film's broader themes about professionalism and interdependence. Gary Oldman and Linda Cardellini, authority, at a distance. Gary Oldman's Admiral John Fisk and Linda Cardellini's NSA analyst Jane Norquist operate primarily in Pentagon command centers, removed from the physical danger but bearing the weight of decisions that could trigger global catastrophe. Both actors face the challenge of making scenes dominated by exposition and debate feel urgent and consequential, and both succeed by playing status and stakes rather than emotion. Oldman brings gravitas simply by virtue of his presence and reputation, but he doesn't coast on that advantage. His Fisk is a career officer who's risen high enough to understand the political dimensions of every military choice. Oldman plays him as someone balancing institutional imperatives, showing strength, maintaining deterrence against the human reality that every order he gives could lead to deaths. There's no single dramatic moment where Fisk breaks down or delivers a soaring speech. Instead, Oldman builds the character through accumulated details, the way he listens to junior analysts, the pauses before he commits to a course of action, the weariness that seeps through his command presence. Cardellini's Norquist provides a crucial civilian perspective in rooms dominated by military brass. She's not intimidated by rank, but she also doesn't grandstand or lecture. Instead, she uses precision and clarity to make her arguments, trusting that if she can present the intelligence correctly, the logic will speak for itself. Cardellini plays Norquist as someone who's learned to navigate institutional power dynamics by being indispensable, by knowing things others don't, and by communicating them in ways that force people to take her seriously. The dynamic between Fisk and Norquist illustrates a healthy civil-military relationship. He respects her expertise without deferring entirely to it, and she challenges his assumptions without overstepping her role. Their scenes together model the kind of collaboration that the film suggests is necessary to prevent disasters, professionals from different backgrounds bringing distinct perspectives to bear on shared problems. The Russian president and coup leaders, archetypes with function. The Russian president, played by Alexander Dyachenko, has limited screen time but carries significant symbolic weight. He's presented as a legitimate leader who, while not idealized as a democratic saint, represents lawful authority and institutional stability. The film doesn't delve deeply into his politics or policies, which is a strategic choice. Making him too sympathetic might feel propagandistic, while making him too flawed would undermine the mission's moral foundation. Instead, he's sketched as competent and committed to preventing catastrophic conflict, enough to justify the rescue without requiring deeper characterization. The defense minister leading the coup, portrayed by Mikhail Gore, embodies a specific archetype: the military hardliner who believes the civilian government has grown too weak, too willing to accommodate rivals, and insufficiently committed to national greatness. Gore plays him with cold calculation rather than hot rage. This isn't a madman ranting about destiny, it's a planner who's thought through every step and convinced himself that engineered crisis is both necessary and justifiable. The character's menace comes from his rationality. He's not delusional, just willing to accept costs that others find unconscionable. Submarine crew as collective character. One of the film's understated achievements is how it makes the Arkansas crew feel like a functional unit rather than a collection of individuals waiting for their spotlight moment. Each crew member has a role: sonar operator, navigator, weapons officer, engineer, and the film respects the idea that mission success depends on every role being executed competently. The sonar operator in particular functions as a kind of sensory organ for the submarine. In scenes where the crew is hunting or being hunted, the camera often cuts to him interpreting acoustic data, translating abstract sounds into actionable intelligence. The film doesn't expect audiences to understand the technical details, but it conveys that expertise matters, that reading sonar is a skill requiring experience and judgment, and that Glass's effectiveness as a captain depends on trusting specialists who know things he doesn't. This ensemble approach extends to moments of crisis. When the submarine takes damage or performs risky maneuvers, the film shows multiple crew members responding simultaneously: damage control teams rushing to seal breaches, engineers adjusting systems, the helm executing course correction. These aren't individuals having personal moments, they're components of a larger organism trying to survive. That collective focus reinforces the thematic interest in interdependence and the idea that modern military operations are fundamentally collaborative, comparing Hunter-Killer to The Hunt for Red October. Any submarine thriller released after 1990 operates in the shadow of The Hunt for Red October, John McTiernan's adaptation of Tom Clancy's novel. That film set a standard for depicting submarine warfare with intelligence and tension, and it featured iconic performances from Sean Connery and Alec Baldwin that elevated the material beyond genre convention. Hunter-Killer can't help but invite comparison, and understanding how the two films differ reveals something about how the genre has evolved. Red October is fundamentally a Cold War artifact, built on the premise that ideological defection is possible and that individuals might reject their nation's political system while maintaining professional integrity. The tension derives from uncertainty: is Ramius defecting or launching an unauthorized attack? And the narrative unfolds as a puzzle that CIA analyst Jack Ryan must solve. The submarine setting serves that mystery structure, allowing for miscommunication, paranoia, and the constant threat of misunderstanding escalating into violence. Hunter-Killer, by contrast, operates in a post-Cold War landscape where ideology has given way to nationalism and where the threat comes not from defection, but from internal coups. There's less mystery about what's happening. The audience learns about the coup relatively early, and more emphasis on execution. Can the rescue mission succeed before the situation spirals beyond control? The film's structure is less about discovering truth and more about coordinating complex operations under time pressure. Where Red October features lengthy scenes of characters explaining technical details and geopolitical nuances, Hunter-Killer moves faster, trusting audiences to grasp essentials without extended exposition. This reflects both changing viewer literacy. Modern audiences are more familiar with military procedures through decades of films and television, and different priorities. Red October is deeply interested in how submarines work and how navies think. Hunter-Killer is more focused on action and pace, using technical details as flavor rather than making them central to the experience. Crimson Tide and the Ethics of Command. Another instructive comparison is to Tony Scott's Crimson Tide, 1995, which explores the tension between following orders and exercising judgment in a nuclear context. That film's central conflict, Captain Ramsey and XO Hutter disagreeing about whether to launch missiles based on an incomplete transmission, directly engages with questions about military hierarchy, the ethics of obedience, and the terrifying responsibility of commanding nuclear weapons. Hunter-Killer touches similar themes but doesn't foreground them as dramatically. Glass makes unorthodox decisions, rescuing Russian sailors, cooperating with Andropov. That could be seen as insubordination, but the film doesn't stage these choices as explicit conflicts with higher authority. Instead, Glass operates in a gray zone where orders are incomplete or ambiguous, giving him latitude to improvise. The structure avoids the stark binary of Ramsey versus Hutter, opting instead for a scenario where adaptation and initiative are necessary, because the situation on the ground doesn't match headquarters' assumption. This difference reflects a shift in how military thrillers approach authority. Crimson Tide was deeply concerned with the formal question of who has the right to make life or death decisions when communication breaks down. Hunter-Killer assumes a more networked model where field commanders, analysts, and senior officers are all contributing to decisions in real time, even if imperfectly. The film's Pentagon scenes show debates and deliberations rather than unilateral commands, suggesting a less rigid hierarchy than earlier submarine films depicted. K-19, The Widowmaker, and the Cost of Service. Catherine Bigelow's K-19, The Widowmaker, 2002, offers another point of reference, particularly in how it depicts Russian naval personnel. That film, based on a real incident, portrays Soviet submariners dealing with a reactor malfunction that exposes them to lethal radiation. It's a story about sacrifice, institutional dysfunction, and the human cost of Cold War military competition. Hunter Killer's portrayal of Russian sailors, particularly through Andropov, shares some tonal similarities with K-19. Both films present Russian military personnel as professionals motivated by duty and loyalty rather than as cartoon villains. Both acknowledge institutional flaws and political pressures without suggesting that individual Russians are fundamentally different from their American counterparts. And both recognize that service in dangerous environments, whether Cold War submarines or modern Arctic patrols, extracts similar costs regardless of nationality. Where K-19 is a tragedy about soldiers betrayed by their own government's negligence, Hunter Killer is more optimistic, suggesting that cooperation across national lines is possible when professionals recognize common threats. The tonal difference reflects the historical moment. K-19 could look back at Cold War failures with tragic distance, while Hunter Killer, made during renewed tensions, needed to find a path toward resolution that didn't rely on either triumphalism or despair. Submarine films and claustrophobic tension. The enduring appeal of submarine settings lies partly in their inherent claustrophobia. Films like Das Boot, 1981, and Kursk, 2018, exploit the tension between human vulnerability and the hostile environment pressing in from all sides. Every creak of the hull, every depth gauge showing dangerous pressure, every moment of mechanical failure carries the implicit threat of catastrophic implosion. Hunter Killer uses this tension but balances it against other environments to prevent the film from feeling too confined. The SEAL mission provides visual and spatial relief, and the Pentagon scenes offer a different kind of space, large, well-lit, but still oppressive in their own way, as characters debate decisions that could cost thousands of lives. This structural variety may dilute some of the pure claustrophobic dread that single-location submarine films achieve, but it also prevents viewer fatigue and allows for pacing shifts that maintain engagement across a 2-hour runtime. The film's best moments of submarine tension come not during combat, but during silent running, when the crew must minimize noise while enemy vessels hunt them. These sequences rely on sound design and performance characters holding their breath, moving with exaggerated care, eyes tracking sonar displays to create dread. The absence of music in these moments is crucial. The silence itself becomes unbearable, and every ambient sound, a dropped tool, a cleared throat, the hum of systems they can't fully shut down, feels like a potential death sentence. Military authenticity versus cinematic license. One recurring debate around military films concerns the balance between authenticity and entertainment. Hunter Killer consulted with naval advisors and submarine veterans to ensure procedural accuracy, but it also takes liberties for dramatic effect. Real submarine operations involve long periods of routine punctuated by brief moments of crisis, which doesn't translate well to feature film pacing. Real special operations missions require extensive planning and preparation that would bog down narrative momentum if depicted in full. The film navigates this tension by prioritizing emotional authenticity over documentary precision. The procedures shown may be compressed or simplified, but the attitudes of the characters, their professionalism, their communication styles, their responses to stress, ring true to people who've served in similar roles. The film understands that audiences aren't counting rivets. They're assessing whether the characters behave like real professionals or like actors pretending. This approach occasionally leads to moments that strain credibility for viewers with military expertise. The timeline of the rescue mission, the ease with which Arkansas evades multiple Russian vessels, the relatively low casualties during the SEAL extraction, all of these might prompt questions from veterans or defense analysts. But these choices serve narrative clarity and pacing, allowing the film to maintain tension without getting bogged down in probabilistic realism that might slow the story to a crawl. The film's treatment of technology and weaponry. Unlike some techno-thrillers that fetishize hardware, Hunter Killer treats submarines, weapon systems, and surveillance technology as tools, rather than as objects of fascination in themselves. There are no extended sequences where characters explain the specifications of torpedoes or the capabilities of sonar arrays. Technology is background infrastructure that enables the story rather than the story's focus. This restraint reflects a mature understanding of audience expectations. By 2018, viewers had seen enough military thrillers to grasp the basics. Submarines detect each other with sonar. Torpedoes can be evaded with countermeasures. Communication with command requires specific systems. The film doesn't waste time re-explaining these fundamentals, instead assuming baseline familiarity and moving directly into dramatic application. When technology does become foregrounded, it's usually at moments of failure or limitation. Communication breakdowns force characters to make decisions without guidance. Sonar proves insufficient to identify threats with certainty. Weapon systems work as designed, but their use carries consequences that technology alone can't resolve. This focus on limitation humanizes the story, reminding audiences that even sophisticated military hardware depends on human judgment and that technology creates as many problems as it solves. Gender representation and military role. The film features Linda Cardellini's Jane Norquist as its most prominent female character, and her role as a civilian intelligence analyst provides an interesting contrast to the male-dominated military environments. Norquist is competent, assertive, and crucial to decision-making, but she's also confined to support and analysis rather than field operations. The film doesn't address gender dynamics explicitly. Norquist's expertise is respected without anyone remarking on her gender, which can be read as either progressive, her gender isn't an issue, or as a missed opportunity to engage with how women navigate male-dominated security institutions. The submarine and SEAL team environments are entirely male, which reflects both the reality of submarine service in many navies. The U.S. Navy only began integrating women into submarine crews in 2010, with full integration taking years, and the film's decision not to anachronistically diversify for contemporary sensibilities. This creates a tonal tension. The film feels dated in its gender representation, yet changing the composition of the crews would sacrifice some authenticity to the specific units being depicted. This is a recurring challenge in military films set in recent past or depicting elite units with restricted composition. Filmmakers must choose between accurate reflection of institutional demographics and inclusive representation that better serves contemporary audiences. Hunter Killer opts for the former, which may limit its appeal but avoids the criticism of historical revisionism that films like The Pentagon Wars or Pearl Harbor face for their handling of similar issues. The Arctic setting as character and challenge. The film's Arctic Ocean setting provides more than just visual atmosphere. It's a tactical and environmental factor that shapes the entire narrative. Arctic waters present unique challenges. Ice coverage limits, surfacing options, acoustic properties differ from warmer seas, extreme cold affects equipment reliability, and the strategic importance of the region, with Russia's Northern Fleet base nearby, adds geopolitical weight. Hunter Killer uses the Arctic environment to create specific dramatic moments. The risk of being trapped under ice, the difficulty of rendezvous operations in waters where GPS and communication are limited, the way ice formations can mask or reveal submarines to detection. These aren't generic underwater obstacles, they're challenges specific to the setting that inform tactical decisions and create unique visual opportunities. The film also taps into contemporary geopolitical interest in the Arctic, where melting ice is opening new shipping routes and resource extraction opportunities while intensifying military competition between Russia, the United States, and other nations. By setting the story in these contested waters, Hunter Killer connects to real-world tensions in ways that a generic ocean setting wouldn't allow. The Arctic isn't just a backdrop, it's a region where great power competition is intensifying, making the film's scenario feel rooted in plausible strategic concerns. The script's structure and narrative economy. The screenplay, adapted by Arne Schmidt and Jamie Moss from Don Keith and George Wallace's novel Firing Point, demonstrates effective narrative economy. It establishes the crisis quickly, introduces key players efficiently, and maintains forward momentum by cutting between storylines at strategic points. There's minimal backstory or character development beyond what's necessary for the plot, which some might view as shallow, but which also prevents the film from getting bogged down in exposition. The structure follows a fairly traditional three-act framework: establishment and crisis in the first act, escalation and complication in the second, convergence and resolution in the third. Within that framework, the script uses parallel editing to create compound tension, cutting between the submarine, the SEAL mission, and command centers in ways that amplify stakes across all three threads. This technique isn't innovative. It's been standard in thrillers for decades, but it's executed with competence. One notable structural choice is how the script handles exposition. Rather than front-loading large amounts of background about U.S.-Russia relations or submarine doctrine, it parcels out information as it becomes relevant. Characters explain things in the moment when they need to make decisions based on that information, which integrates exposition into action rather than stopping the narrative for lectures. This approach trusts audiences to follow along and fill in gaps through context, which keeps pacing tight. Moral complexity and the good war myth. Hunter Killer operates in moral territory that's more ambiguous than traditional war films where enemies are clearly defined and victory unambiguously good. The coup plotters are villains, but the Russian military personnel following their orders are professionals doing their jobs based on information they believe to be accurate. The American intervention is justified by preventing a larger catastrophe, but it also involves violating sovereignty and killing Russian soldiers who aren't themselves responsible for the coup. The film doesn't dwell on these moral complications extensively, but it doesn't ignore them either. The scenes where Glass chooses to disable rather than destroy the attacking Russian submarine, or where American forces work to minimize casualties during the extraction, gesture toward an ethical framework that values restraint even in combat. These choices aren't framed as naive or soft, they're strategic decisions that serve broader goals beyond immediate tactical advantage. This moral nuance distinguishes Hunter-Killer from more straightforward action films where enemies exist to be eliminated without regret. The story suggests that in a nuclear age, where conflicts can escalate beyond control, the ability to de-escalate and limit violence is a crucial military skill, not a weakness. Whether the film fully explores these ideas or simply nods toward them is debatable, but the fact that it raises them at all reflects a more sophisticated approach than many genre entries attempt.